In 1927, a 21-year-old inventor named Philo Farnsworth transmitted the first electronic television image in history, a simple straight line. His financial backers were unimpressed. They had invested thousands of dollars and expected something more spectacular than a line on a screen. "When are we going to see some dollars?" one asked impatiently. Farnsworth, exhausted from months of work, gestured at the glowing line and replied quietly, "This is it. This is television." What his investors couldn't see was that the line represented a revolution. It proved that images could be transmitted electronically without mechanical parts, that television as we know it was possible. Within weeks, Farnsworth would transmit recognizable images. Within months, he would file patents that described the fundamental principles of electronic television. And within years, he would face an enemy far more dangerous than technical challenges: David Sarnoff and the Radio Corporation of America, the same corporation that would later destroy Edwin Armstrong. RCA would spend 2 decades trying to crush Farnsworth, steal his inventions, and erase him from history. They would nearly succeed. Philo Taylor Farnsworth was born in 1906 in a log cabin in Utah, the eldest of 5 children. His family were Mormon farmers, hardworking and poor, moving frequently in search of better land. In 1919, when Philo was 13, the family moved to a farm in Idaho that had something miraculous: electricity. For a boy who had grown up reading by kerosene lamp, electric lights were magic. He devoured every magazine and book he could find about electricity, studying diagrams of motors, generators, and the new science of electronics. While other farm boys learned to plow and harvest, Philo taught himself advanced physics and electrical engineering from mail-order magazines. One day in 1921, while plowing his family's potato field, 14-year-old Philo had an insight that would change the world. He was guiding the horse-drawn plow in straight, parallel lines across the field when he realized that an image could be transmitted the same way. Existing television systems used mechanical spinning discs with holes that scanned images line by line. They were clumsy, unreliable, and produced terrible picture quality. But what if you could scan an image electronically, using a beam of electrons that swept back and forth across a screen, just like plowing a field? Each line would capture one horizontal slice of the image. The lines together would create a complete picture. It was elegant, simple, and unlike anything anyone else was working on. Philo sketched his idea on a blackboard for his high school chemistry teacher, Justin Tolman, explaining how electrons could be used to capture and transmit images. Tolman didn't fully understand the concept, but he recognized that his student was exceptional. He encouraged Philo to develop the idea and kept the sketch, a decision that would prove crucial years later. Philo continued refining his television system in his mind through high school. Though he lacked the money and equipment to build anything, his family was too poor to send him to college. After his father died in 1924, Philo had to support his mother and siblings, taking odd jobs and dreaming of the television system he couldn't build. In 1926, Philo met George Everson, a professional fundraiser who was impressed by the young man's intelligence and vision. Philo explained his television concept, drawing diagrams and describing how electronic scanning would revolutionize broadcasting. Everson understood little of the technical details but was convinced Philo was brilliant. He agreed to raise $6,000 for Philo to build a prototype, an enormous sum for an untested 20-year-old inventor. Everson's partner, Leslie Gorel, was skeptical but agreed to the investment. They formed a partnership, moved to Los Angeles, and rented a small laboratory where Philo began building his image dissector, the first electronic television camera. The work was brutally difficult. Philo was entirely self-taught, working from principles he'd learned in magazines and books. He needed to create a vacuum tube that could scan an image with a beam of electrons, convert light into electrical signals, and transmit those signals to a receiver that could reconstruct the image. Every component had to be designed from scratch and hand-built. Philo worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, assisted by his wife Pim and a small team. His investors grew increasingly nervous as months passed with no results. Money was running out. Philo was 20 years old, exhausted and running out of time. On September 7, 1927, Philo achieved the breakthrough. He transmitted a simple image, a straight line from one room to another using his electronic system. It was crude and flickering, but it worked. Over the following weeks, he transmitted dollar signs, photographs, and eventually moving images. The system functioned. Electronic television was real. Philo immediately filed patents describing his image dissector camera tube and the complete television system. He was ecstatic. He had invented television at age 21, working in a small laboratory with minimal funding. Now he just needed to commercialize it and collect royalties from the companies that would manufacture television sets. He had no idea that the largest electronics corporation in America was about to try to destroy him. David Sarnoff, the president of RCA, was building an empire. RCA controlled radio broadcasting through patents on critical technologies. Sarnoff envisioned television as the next frontier. A medium RCA would dominate as completely as it dominated radio. RCA had been developing television since the early 1920s, investing millions in research. Their lead engineer, Vladimir Zworykin, a Russian immigrant and brilliant scientist, was working on electronic television. When Sarnoff learned in 1930 that an unknown 23-year-old from Idaho had already invented a working electronic television system and filed patents on it, he was furious. Sarnoff's strategy was simple: crush Farnsworth and take his patents. First, RCA sent engineers to visit Farnsworth's laboratory, ostensibly to discuss licensing his technology. The engineers studied everything, took notes, and returned to RCA with detailed reports on how Farnsworth's system worked. RCA then had Zworykin independently invent remarkably similar technology. When Farnsworth accused RCA of stealing his ideas, Sarnoff responded coldly, "RCA doesn't pay royalties. We collect them." It was a declaration of war. RCA would use its vast resources, legal team, and political influence to ensure that if anyone profited from television, it would be RCA, not some farm boy from Idaho. The legal battle began in 1932 and lasted for years. RCA claimed that Zworykin, not Farnsworth, had invented electronic television. They filed competing patents and challenged Farnsworth's patents in interference proceedings, legal battles to determine who invented what first. RCA had unlimited resources for litigation. They could afford the best patent lawyers in America and could keep cases tied up in courts indefinitely. Farnsworth had limited funds and investors who were growing impatient. Every dollar spent on lawyers was a dollar not spent on developing television for commercial production. RCA's goal wasn't necessarily to win in court, it was to exhaust Farnsworth financially and psychologically until he gave up. The Patent Office interference hearings turned on the question of invention dates. Who had conceived electronic television first, and who had actually built a working system first? RCA claimed Zworykin had invented electronic television in the early 1920s, before Farnsworth. If true, Farnsworth's patents would be invalid. Farnsworth's lawyers faced a daunting challenge, proving that a farm boy from Idaho with no formal training had invented television as a teenager and successfully built it before RCA's highly credentialed engineers. The case seemed impossible. Then Farnsworth's lawyers tracked down Justin Tolman, his high school chemistry teacher from Idaho. Tolman testified before the Patent Office in 1934, producing the sketch Farnsworth had drawn on his blackboard in 1921. When he was just 14 years old, the sketch showed the basic principles of electronic television, scanning an image line by line using electrons exactly as Farnsworth's later patents described. Tolman testified that Farnsworth had explained the concept in detail, demonstrating understanding of advanced physics at age 14. The Patent Office was stunned. RCA's lawyers tried to discredit the testimony, suggesting the sketch was a later forgery or that Tolman was lying, but Tolman was unshakable. He had witnessed a 14-year-old boy invent television while plowing a potato field. In 1935, the Patent Office ruled in Farnsworth's favor. His patents were valid, he had invented electronic television, and his invention predated Zworykin's work. It was a stunning victory. RCA had been defeated by a farm boy and a high school teacher's sketch. Farnsworth should have been vindicated, wealthy, and celebrated. Instead, the victory marked the beginning of a more brutal phase of RCA's war against him. Sarnoff refused to accept defeat. If RCA couldn't invalidate Farnsworth's patents, it would make those patents worthless by building television using different approaches, flooding the market with RCA sets, and ensuring that Farnsworth's technology was bypassed. Through the late 1930s, RCA developed its own television technology, carefully designed to avoid Farnsworth's patents where possible, while borrowing his fundamental concepts. Zworykin's iconoscope camera tube and kinescope display tube used principles remarkably similar to Farnsworth's designs, but with enough differences to potentially avoid patent infringement. RCA began demonstrating television at the 1939 World's Fair in New York, positioning itself as the inventor of television. Sarnoff appeared on camera declaring the dawn of the television age. Farnsworth's name was never mentioned. The public narrative became that RCA and Zworykin had invented television. Farnsworth, the actual inventor, was being written out of history. Farnsworth continued fighting. He licensed his patents to companies willing to challenge RCA, including Philco, one of RCA's competitors. Legal battles continued through the late 1930s, but Farnsworth was slowly losing. The costs were enormous. His investors were tired of lawsuits and wanted to see profits. Farnsworth's health was deteriorating from stress. He began drinking heavily, seeking escape from the endless legal warfare. His marriage suffered. His laboratory work suffered. The genius who had invented television at 21 was, by his mid-30s, exhausted, alcoholic, and watching his life's work be stolen by a corporation more powerful than he could fight. In 1939, RCA finally agreed to pay Farnsworth licensing fees for his patents, a rare acknowledgement from Sarnoff's company that they actually needed someone else's technology. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The fees were far less than Farnsworth deserved, and the agreement came with restrictions that limited his ability to compete. Most importantly, Farnsworth's patents would begin expiring in the 1940s. He would receive royalties for a few years, then RCA and others could use his inventions freely. The timing couldn't have been worse. Television was about to explode as a mass medium, and just as it did, Farnsworth's patents would expire. He would receive almost nothing from the industry he had created. World War II delayed television's commercial development. The government halted civilian production, diverting manufacturing to military equipment. Farnsworth's company contributed to the war effort, developing radar and other electronics. But the television revolution was put on hold. When the war ended in 1945, commercial television finally launched on a massive scale. Millions of Americans bought television sets. Broadcasting networks expanded rapidly. Television became the dominant medium of American culture within a decade. And Philo Farnsworth, the man who had invented it, received almost nothing. His patents had expired. RCA and other manufacturers built televisions using his fundamental principles, but paid him no royalties. The injustice destroyed him. Farnsworth had sacrificed everything for television. He had worked himself to exhaustion, spent decades in legal battles, and had his invention stolen by a corporation that then claimed credit for it. He had been right, and it hadn't mattered. RCA's power and wealth had overwhelmed his technical brilliance. By the late 1940s, Farnsworth was an alcoholic, depressed and bitter. His investors had long since moved on. His company struggled. He continued inventing, working on radar, nuclear fusion, and other projects. But his heart was broken. The television age he had created was happening without him. In 1949, Farnsworth's company was sold to IT&T. He became a consultant with no real power or influence. He worked on various projects through the 1950s and 1960s, but television, his greatest achievement, brought him only pain. He rarely spoke about his role in inventing it, and when he did, it was with bitterness. He once told a colleague that there was nothing on television worth watching, that the medium had been debased into entertainment garbage. His invention was supposed to educate and enlighten. Instead, it broadcast sitcoms and commercials. It was one more disappointment in a life full of them. David Sarnoff, meanwhile, was celebrated as a visionary leader who had brought television to America. He was featured in magazines, received awards, and was credited with developing television. RCA's publicity machine ensured that Sarnoff and Zworykin were remembered as television's creators. Farnsworth was forgotten, a footnote in histories written by the winners. The farm boy who had actually invented television was erased from the story. It was Armstrong all over again, a brilliant inventor destroyed by Sarnoff and RCA, his achievements stolen, his life ruined. Sarnoff had learned that crushing innovators was profitable. He had done it to Armstrong with FM radio. He did it to Farnsworth with television. It was a business model. Philo Farnsworth died in 1971 at age 64, largely forgotten and unrecognized. His obituaries mentioned that he had contributed to the development of television, but rarely identified him as its inventor. The television industry, which owed its existence to him, said little. There were no major memorials or tributes. He died in relative poverty, his greatest invention having enriched everyone except himself. His wife Pim, who had worked alongside him in his laboratory and supported him through decades of struggle, was left with almost nothing. The farm boy genius who had invented television ended his life broken, alcoholic, and bitter, his legacy stolen by a corporation too powerful to fight. But slowly, history began correcting itself. In the decades after Farnsworth's death, historians and engineers researching television's origins realized that the standard narrative was false. RCA's claims that Zworykin invented television didn't hold up under scrutiny. Zworykin's early television work was mechanical and primitive. His electronic television system was developed in the 1930s after Farnsworth's. Patent records clearly showed that Farnsworth had invented and demonstrated electronic television first. The patent office had ruled in his favor. The evidence was overwhelming. Philo Farnsworth, not Vladimir Zworykin, not David Sarnoff, not RCA, had invented television. By the 1990s, Farnsworth was finally receiving recognition. Documentaries told his story. Books were written about his life and inventions. In 1999, Time magazine named him one of the 100 most important people of the 20th century. The state of Utah placed a statue of him in the U.S. Capitol's National Statuary Hall, representing Utah alongside Brigham Young. It was vindication, but it came too late. Farnsworth had died nearly 3 decades earlier, never knowing that history would eventually acknowledge him as television's true inventor. Like Armstrong, his victory was posthumous, meaningless to the man who had suffered for it. Pim Farnsworth, Philo's widow, lived until 2006 and spent her later years preserving her husband's legacy. She gave interviews, wrote a memoir, and worked with historians to ensure the true story of television's invention was told. She was tireless in defending Philo's reputation, correcting the lies RCA had spread, and ensuring that new generations understood that a farm boy from Idaho, not a giant corporation, had invented television. When she died at age 98, she had succeeded. Philo Farnsworth was finally recognized as television's inventor, but the recognition couldn't erase the tragedy of his life. The technical legacy of Farnsworth's work is undeniable. His image dissector tube and his fundamental patents on electronic scanning formed the basis for all television until digital technology emerged decades later. Every cathode, ray tube television, the dominant technology from the 1940s through the 1990s, used principles Farnsworth had invented. Modern flat panel displays use different technology, but they still rely on electronic scanning of images line by line, the concept Farnsworth conceived while plowing a field at age 14. Billions of screens worldwide in televisions, computer monitors, and smartphones are descendants of Farnsworth's invention. The story of Philo Farnsworth and television mirrors Edwin Armstrong's tragedy with FM radio almost exactly. Both were brilliant inventors who created revolutionary technologies. Both were opposed by the same man, David Sarnoff, and the same corporation, RCA. Both were destroyed through legal warfare, financial exhaustion, and corporate theft of their inventions. Both died broken and bitter, their achievements stolen, and both were eventually vindicated by history, though too late to matter to them personally. The parallels suggest that Farnsworth and Armstrong's fates weren't accidental or unique. They were predictable outcomes of a system that allowed powerful corporations to crush individual inventors with impunity. The tragedy extends beyond Farnsworth personally. His story illustrates how patent systems, supposedly designed to protect inventors, often fail when corporate power is involved. Farnsworth had valid patents and won his legal battles, yet he was still destroyed. RCA simply ignored the patents until they expired, developed workarounds, and used its market dominance to ensure that even if Farnsworth was legally right, he was commercially irrelevant. The system worked perfectly for RCA and catastrophically for Farnsworth. It suggests that patent protection is meaningful only if inventors have the resources to defend their patents against well-funded opponents, which individual inventors rarely do. There's also a broader question about innovation and credit. RCA's narrative that it invented television was believed for decades despite being false. Corporations have the resources to shape public understanding of history. They fund publicity, write press releases, and control narratives. Individual inventors lack these resources. Farnsworth couldn't afford a publicity campaign to counter RCA's lies. He was too busy working and fighting lawsuits, so RCA's version became accepted truth, and Farnsworth was forgotten. How many other inventors have been similarly erased? How much of technological history is corporate mythology rather than accurate accounting of who actually invented what? Modern inventors face similar challenges. Large technology companies routinely appropriate innovations from smaller competitors, using legal warfare and market power to crush opposition. Patent trolling, where companies buy patents solely to sue others, is common. Independent inventors struggle to commercialize innovations because venture capital flows to established companies rather than unknown individuals. The system that destroyed Farnsworth still exists, just with different players and technologies. The fundamental dynamic, concentrated corporate power overwhelming individual innovation, remains unchanged. Yet Farnsworth's story also demonstrates that truth eventually emerges. It took decades, but his contribution was finally recognized. This offers cold comfort to Farnsworth himself, who died without recognition. But it suggests that historical justice, however delayed, is possible. Archival records, patent documents, and testimony from people like Justin Tolman preserved the truth. When historians finally examined the evidence objectively, freed from RCA's influence, the real story became clear. This vindication was posthumous and economically worthless, but it mattered to Farnsworth's family and to historical accuracy. The comparison between Farnsworth and Zorikin is also instructive. Zorikin was a talented engineer who made important contributions to television technology, but he worked within RCA with unlimited funding, support staff, and access to the best equipment. Farnsworth worked in a small laboratory with minimal funding and taught himself everything. That Farnsworth invented television first, despite these disadvantages, demonstrates the power of individual genius when unencumbered by corporate bureaucracy. But it also shows that genius alone isn't enough. Zorikin had institutional support, Farnsworth didn't. In the end, institutional support mattered more than genius. Farnsworth's television system also represents a fundamental shift in how images were captured and transmitted. Mechanical television, which used spinning discs and complex mechanical systems, was inherently limited. Electronic television, using beams of electrons controlled by electrical signals, was fast, reliable, and capable of high resolution. This shift from mechanical to electronic systems was profound, analogous to the shift from mechanical calculators to computers. Farnsworth enabled that transition, creating the conceptual framework and technical foundation for electronic imaging. His influence extends beyond television to all electronic imaging technologies. The irony of Farnsworth barely profiting from television while billions were made by others is almost unbearable. Every television set sold from the 1940s onward used his fundamental inventions. Manufacturers made fortunes, broadcasters built empires, advertisers created industries. All of this wealth flowed from Farnsworth's teenage insight while plowing a field, yet almost none of it reached him. The disconnect between creating value and capturing value has rarely been so stark. Farnsworth created an industry worth trillions over its lifetime. He died nearly broke. The system that allowed this outcome is morally indefensible. Philo Farnsworth's alcoholism and depression in his later years weren't personal failings but predictable responses to injustice. He had been robbed, publicly and systematically, by forces he couldn't fight. His life's work had been stolen. The credit for his invention had been given to others. His patents had been circumvented. He had nothing to show for decades of work and sacrifice. That he turned to alcohol is hardly surprising. What's surprising is that he continued working at all, that he didn't give up completely. His continued inventing, even on projects unrelated to television, suggests a man who still believed in innovation despite everything it had cost him. The ultimate question is whether Farnsworth's suffering was necessary for television to exist. Would television have been invented without him? Probably yes, eventually. Zuraikin and others were working on electronic television and would have succeeded eventually, but Farnsworth got there first and developed the fundamental concepts that others built on. Without him, television might have taken years longer to develop, delaying the entire medium. His contribution accelerated television's development significantly. Whether that contribution justified his suffering depends on one's values. From a utilitarian perspective, billions of people gained entertainment and information from television, arguably outweighing one man's tragedy. From a justice perspective, his treatment was unconscionable regardless of television's benefits to others. There's one final bitter detail to Farnsworth's story. In 1969, as Farnsworth lay dying, NASA broadcast the Apollo 11 moon landing on television. Farnsworth's wife, Pim, asked him if his invention had been worthwhile. He had spent his life regretting television, believing it had been debased into worthless entertainment. But watching Neil Armstrong step onto the moon's surface, broadcast live via electronic television to hundreds of millions of people worldwide, Farnsworth's perspective shifted. "This is worth it," he told Pim. "This has made it all worthwhile." It was the only time in decades he had said anything positive about television. Days later, he was dead. The farm boy who invented television, destroyed by the corporation that claimed his invention, died believing his life's work had finally accomplished something meaningful. One moon landing redeemed decades of sitcoms and commercials in his eyes. Whether that redemption was sufficient is debatable, but it gave Farnsworth peace before he died, and perhaps that's enough. He had invented television at 14 while plowing a field. He had built it at 21 in a tiny laboratory. He had defended it through decades of legal warfare, and in his final days, he watched it transmit images from the moon. The farm boy had reached the moon after all, just not in the way anyone expected. Philo Farnsworth heard the future and built it with electron beams. RCA tried to bury him and steal his invention. They succeeded in destroying his life, but failed to erase his contribution. Television conquered the world using his principles. He won the patent battles, but lost the war, dying poor and forgotten while others grew rich from his genius. Then history corrected the record, too late to save him, but soon enough to restore his name. The farm boy genius, the 14-year-old who understood electrons, the inventor who changed how billions of humans see the world. He received no royalties, no wealth, no recognition in life, just a statue in Utah and the knowledge in his final days that his invention had transmitted images from the moon. The screen you're looking at exists because a boy named Philo plowed a field in straight lines and saw in those lines the future of human communication. RCA took the credit. History took it back. The farm boy inventor won, posthumously, completely, and far too late.